1, 2. Hey, hey, hey. Oh. Welcome. Great to have everyone here. Are you guys recording yet? Okay, cool. I'm just going to tell jokes while they record. Celine Dion walks into a bar and the barman says, "Why the long face?" That's all I had, and I think from then on...
It was well. Yeah. Took a minute.
Well, just to comment on Celine Dion's slightly...
Don't.
Brilliant. I think I've nailed it, and I'm just going to go home from now on. Welcome to the 21st Century Music Practice Conference. We're all so glad to have you here, and we're glad to everyone who's done some quite significant travelling as well. It's quite overwhelming to have people travelling to our little old place in London, and we really are extremely grateful to have you here. We will be going to the pub at the end of this. Simon will mention some things about that in the final session. General ground rules. This is discourse. Maybe if we avoid it getting heated, that would be great. I don't think we're really going to have a massive amount of trouble with people getting in fistfights or anything like that. The format is something that Liz, Veronica, Simon, and myself spent quite a while workshopping and dreaming up. How can we make conferences a bit more engaging than someone reading a paper? Because we all know our papers, and there are these really interesting discussion points about our papers, and quite often in the Q&As, things get really super interesting. We dig into cool ideas, but we thought, well, what if we put the papers online, start the discourse straight away? So with each one of these, there will be a moderator. The wonderful, our co-chairs, Veronica, will be taking the first one. The only other comment that I need to make is at the end of the day, post 3:30 refreshments, the last 5:30 session we've ended up getting 50 people in, which we're very happy about. However, that means we can't really squeeze 50 people into one of these rooms, so we've just relocated the last room, which is at the opposite end of the university, so we might do some sort of drag everyone down, because this place can be a little bit of a maze. So just in the final afternoon break, come find Liz, Veronica, Simon, or myself, and we will be happy to escort you down. Also, any of the students wearing blue are ambassadors, and they're here to help you, so if you're lost, need the loo or something like that, they'll explain to you how to go to the loo and all that sort of stuff. I'm going to stop because I'm not very funny.
Hello. Yes. So, shall we start with each kind of paper doing their little summary of things? Do you want to start?
Hey, so I'm Dr. Maha Charabi. I'm from BIMM London. My research is looking at, which I hope you've watched, by the way. My research is looking at improving the visibility of women as technical performers in the music industry. So what we've seen is, on the whole, you've got a lot of male behind-the-scenes videos when there's a release campaign. So I'm talking from a realistic release campaign. You're putting a record out, and what you're seeing usually for the guys is a lot of, the behind the scenes, working in the studio, practicing, talking about their instruments. And what you see from girls tends to be a lot less studio and technical based. It tends to be a lot of pictures, and we realize that this kind of is what engages the fan base as well. But the idea was to improve the visibility of that technical role and see what kind of impact it would have on the perception of women in music. So, one of the motivations for doing this is, has anyone seen the Lucy Harcourt series where she removed male musicians from festival lineups? Has anyone seen that? Okay, yeah, so it really is. So what she was doing, I think she's a journalist, she took leading festival posters and she removed all of the men from the poster. And when she did that, there was no one left, pretty much. So there's a massive lack of female representation when it comes to the main stages at festivals. And the thing is, there's lots of debates online which got quite heated as well, which were talking about, well, maybe the women's bands are not big enough to support festivals booking. But essentially my research is looking at potential causal factors that might lead into that. So, for example, it might not be that the festivals are alienating women. It might actually be that women are not represented by booking agents, or it might be that managers are not picking up as many female musicians, perhaps singers, but not actually instrumentalists. Or it might be that record labels are less likely to support them. So, as a female musician myself and working with a collective of female musicians, I thought that what we would do is to just uncover what we're doing behind the scenes, share this as part of a real release campaign, and see if it had any impact. Am I going on too long, or is it okay? Okay, all right. So essentially, these videos were just shot from behind the scenes in studio sessions, in rehearsal sessions, and just showed us working together, kind of working out bits like, oh, you sing this bit, I sing that bit, or, interviews about how the drummer warms up and things like that, things that are very standard to musicians, but perhaps not seen as part of a publicity campaign. Got some great comments, got some unusual comments like, oh yeah, what's this? Or, oh, this is so boring. Or, but the thing is, it was just part of the campaign. It's just something behind the scenes. And the idea then was just to check whether those videos really did demonstrate what I intended them to show. So had a lot of responses, qualitative feedback. And yeah, people found the videos empowering, they found them technical or talking about instrumentation. So it was measuring what it was setting out to measure. And then from there, I adapted a scale which looks at female empowerment in the workplace. So this is the Skrimsjö empowerment scale, and it's been used in loads of different settings, like, factory workers or nurses, and I just adapted it to look at female musicians, and also changed it so that it was assessing the perception of female musicians rather than female musicians assessing themselves. So what I did then, I've still got time, right? I asked 100 people baseline scores that they'd never seen any of these videos whatsoever. And yeah, the ratings were not bad. People perceived that women have, fair empowerment as musicians. Competence was fairly high. Impact was not as high, but which is understandable if you think about festival bills and so on. Like, impact probably is a lot lower than the output. And I got a baseline score of about 100 from about 100 people. And then just with a small sample size initially, showed these videos and interviewed people that had naturally seen these videos as part of the release campaign, and then statistically compared the control group with the intervention group, essentially, which are the people that had seen the videos, and found that there was actually a statistically significant difference in the perception of women's empowerment after they'd seen these videos. And as well as that, the perceived competence. So essentially what I'm arguing with that paper is that it's not, they weren't anything special. They were just videos from the studio, but increasing the visibility of them had a positive impact on the perception. And this is like, it's a 15-minute intervention. So yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Brenda Combs. I am a third-year doctoral student here at the University of West London. My research focuses on mental health and the music industry, specifically the artist-manager relationship. So what I've done is I've taken 13 artist managers working in the UK. I've done qualitative interviews, about 45 minutes, semi-structured, and I was assessing not only their knowledge of mental health resources available in the UK, but beginning to learn more about the artist-manager relationship. I have found some very interesting data through this, but specifically for this panel of creative entrepreneurship. My presentation discussed how the artist manager is a creative entrepreneur. In general, a manager, is paid by an entrepreneur, but as an artist manager, you are finding talent, and then you are the vessel that brings the music kind of to the media, and essentially the vessel that brings the music to the record label. So as an artist manager, you are a creative entrepreneur. And I also looked into the effects of social media and digital dissemination on the mental health of the artists. In general, my study looked at different themes such as workload, payment, but specifically for what we're discussing today, there is some very interesting data on social media. So in the very beginning of my semi-structured interview, I asked music managers, what do you think has increased conversations, awareness, resources throughout the UK in terms of mental health awareness? As I'm sure we're all well aware, mental health is a bit of a taboo in the music industry. When Adele went through her divorce, nobody wanted to know how she was doing. Everyone was just excited for the next album, which was fantastic. But the idea of the tortured artist or the sad creative is unfortunately very common in our day-to-day lives. So to look at the artist as someone who needs mental health care is only beginning to become prevalent. So to look into that, I asked participants, what do you think has caused this increase in awareness? Over 60% of participants stated that social media was the number one source for increasing these conversations. While I agree with that sentiment, past research shows that social media, digital dissemination, and other technological advances are the main reason that the workload has increased for not only artists, but their managers. With social media, we have creative autonomy. Musicians can promote, create, and sell their music pretty much on their own. And with that, it has really taken away the need for a record label. And while many of us love that, it has highly increased the workload. So this increased workload is by far the number one reason for mental health issues in the music industry. A little bit of past research. Sally Ann Gross, who worked with the University of Westminster, conducted a two-part study where she looked into the creative mind to try and discover, can music make you sick? What is the true reason that creatives are have such serious mental health issues? And through that study, she found that it was not music making, it was working within the music industry. So with my study and hopefully others, we can look into what aspects of the music industry are specifically affecting artists' mental health, and what can we do to start to change that to make a culture of well-being for artists, and hopefully at some point, managers and other members of the artist team. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Massimiliano Raffa. I'm a PhD candidate. I'm going to discuss my PhD in sociology of music in a couple of weeks at the University in Milan, Italy. And my presentation, I don't know if you've seen my video, the title was How Can We Understand Platform Optimized Music Making? So everything revolved around this seemingly abstruse question. And platform optimization, it's nothing but adjusting various elements of a music piece, such as its structure, form, arrangement, and so on, to meet the perceived affordances of social media and music streaming services. Because I've noticed that producers seems today to be questioning how to sonically, structurally, and compositionally optimize their music in order to maximize its platform performance. So to meet the taste of recommendation algorithms, to captivate the attention of curators, and to facilitate music pieces synchronization with social media content. So I've to verify these alleged optimization, I've conducted a qualitative study. I've interviewed 10 professional music producers working in the mainstream industry in Italy. So it's a country-specific research. It may not be valid in all the markets, but I think the results I got are pretty significant, because the professional music producers I've interviewed said that the production and songwriting, they were aligned on many matters, but the perception that emerged is that production and songwriting work nowadays in mainstream pop is progressively undergoing a process of standardization. The use of technology is gradually becoming less exploratory and innovative, as it primarily serves the purpose of streamlining the creative processes to align with what is believed to be the preferred sonic or structural attributes that platform to reward. So I found 3 areas of interest that emerged from the interviews. The first one is hyper optimization, because artists and clients are increasingly asking producers to deliver tracks that perform well on platforms. So producers are now trying to understand how to make playlistable music. For instance, I don't know, producing songs between 122 and 127 bits per minute. So they have the 8 bars of the chorus with a duration of 15 seconds, which was the duration of an Instagram story and things like that. I had a presentation with interesting excerpts from the interviews, but we can discuss it later. So this is the hyper-optimization area. The second one was the creative compression, because producers reported that they're asked to deliver work within increasingly tight deadlines. And clients, so managers, record companies, artists, seem obsessed with platform performance, which would negatively affect the work of producers, according to the interviewees. Industry pressure to produce quickly, combined with technology's ability to simplify creative processes, and the awareness that audiences expect increasingly simplified products, have reduced the possibilities compared to the past to deviate from the dominant canons. So that's what the producers said. We can't make anything really challenging in terms of artistic quality, because sometimes the deadlines are 48 hours, and in 48 hours we can't make The Dark Side of the Moon. And the third area is technical standardization, because they seemed aligned with this idea that musical elements that most strongly resonate with audiences on digital platforms are not primarily harmonic or melodic, but rather rhythmic and especially timbral. And producers' work would have predominantly become an assembly process, like assembly line. They no longer need any musical competence, because they are using, like, I don't know, computer-aided composition tools, systematic sampling from libraries, or they rely on songwriting sessions where all these songwriters, which are producers, because the authorial function has changed a lot in the recent years. Everyone, brings something. I got this sample, I got this riff, I got this top line. Let's put everything together. So it's like assembly line. And these practices would have led to an excessive standardization of creative processes, in their opinion. So this is the perceived, because this study I've conducted is a qualitative study that doesn't want to depict an objective reality. I just wanted to know what are the perception of producers. But I'm also interested in understanding how can we get the objective plane of platform optimization. And I got some ideas. There are many methods that I think that could be used, but I'm not satisfied with any of them. Because, for instance, we can use walkthrough methods, which are these methods like studying the technical infrastructure of platforms and DOS, but I think there's some technological determinism as an inherent bias of these methods, and it's very hard to apply to creative processes. It's used in app studies. Or, for instance, we can use activity logs analysis and then create a script with a programming language, but I'm not sure that those allow to have an activity log, like a register with all the operation you've done on the DAW. Maybe on Ableton Live it's possible to have something like that, but I use Pro Tools and Logic Pro, and I never seen anything like that. But it could be interesting, even though it could be a little bit too much quantitative, and it would exclude human interaction. Then we can have a screencast analysis. I don't know if anybody ever did anything like that. So it's like recording the screen output of producers on DAWs. It might show well any standardized practice with an interesting stress on DAW's graphical user interface, but I think it might be overly time-consuming. And then another method that we can use is songwriting sessions, participant observation, so a microsociological method. So that will be a strong focus on individual interaction and communication processes, but predictably professional producers will be very reluctant in having researchers in the way. So it's very hard to make it. Yeah, I just wanted to. I came here to get some suggestion because, as you can imagine, I'm pretty confused. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. It's another joke, isn't it? I mean, there's plenty to talk about from there, but shall we open up straight away? If anyone has any questions or things they want to kind of talk further on from any of the papers, go on, Dan.
Technology, they got a huge grant, and the purpose of it was to deal with the issue with producer performer credits. And what they were trying to do was put the performer credits, of just names of instrumentalists who produced it, and all the sort of back-end data into Pro Tools, so that it can be searchable, so that it's incredibly easy to find out what the metadata is on songs. DigiDesign wouldn't let them in. So I'm not sure if it's changed with Avid. So this might be a conversation worth having with Avid, because I think it's, I also think that the lack of credit really negatively affects musicians from all stripes. So it's just an interesting thing to keep pushing on, getting these platforms to open up their backhand a little bit and be a touch more democratic, but I'm not sure if you can get a big corporation to be democratic.
Thank you. It's more of a comment. I mean, I know that was mainly addressed at the kind of the Massimiliano's paper, but that sounds like it has a bit of similarities to what both of your papers are thinking about as well, of the issue with actually giving credit where it's meant to be given, where we might want to give credit, and kind of drawing those strands out. Do you have any thoughts on kind of those issues?
Yeah, I mean, definitely metadata on the whole could be improved if that's what you're talking about. Within tracks, like you were saying, I would say, yeah, definitely you could, but I don't really have much from my study angle on that, I'm afraid.
And yeah, I guess in the same light, mental health wise, I mean, getting credit is definitely one of the stressors. But yeah, it's kind of on a very, very long list of stressors, but definitely up there. Definitely.
Yeah, I was just listening to a podcast on Discogs, and one of the people working there was saying that the most collected thing in everyone's record collection that you wouldn't think of is actually Bob Ludwig, because he's touched most things, but no one would guess that that's the top thing that people have in their collection. So kind of similar points there.
Can I add some more on that?
Yes.
So, okay, going back to that point, I guess then the thing is that with female musicians, everyone's heard female musicians, but if you hear it through the, you know, the mediums of radio and so on and films and TV, you don't know that you're hearing female musicians. So for some reason, it's probably assumed that the instrumentalists on tracks are male, whereas a lot of the time they are women. So actually, metadata could help fix that as well. Yeah.
And you spoke about Dark Side of the Moon, but a track on there, the female vocalist, which I think is one of the most beautiful aspects of the track. I don't think she received royalties. I'm pretty sure it was a one-off, if anything. She did in the end, but there was an issue with that. So interesting bringing Dark Side of the Moon into it, but with, the credit.
21st century.
Do we have any other questions, comments? We'll start.
I can speak loud.
We're recording everything. So
I see. Okay. Well, good morning, and thank you for those really good talks. I kind of have a question that may basically address the three talks. So I'm a record producer and I teach music production. And there's an exercise I've been giving to my students for many years now in different countries. It's like pick the track that you love for so many years and start by looking at who produced it, who engineered it, as well as who performed, who composed it, etc. So, and I don't let them do a Bohemian Rhapsody or Monet jingle, that kind of thing, because otherwise it's too easy. And then look at the producer and check what they have done. And try to see if you kind of discover new music with it. So that's usually like a groundbreaking assignment, because they're like, oh, I never thought of this, but actually I really love what that person has done. When you get out of George Martin, Phil Spector, all those people we know the name of. And then I say, look at your streaming platform, your favorite one, the one you use every day, and first of all try to see who produced the track, which is not always easy. And then can you click on that name and get to the other track this person produced? And it's not possible. So beyond the royalties and all this, I'm wondering why there's still no interest in the music industry to find, those people who spend hours, days, months working on a track. Linked it to the other talks, because I guess it's a lot of your talk, but I work a lot about gender, and I found that. Well, I mean, in your talk, and I put a comment on the YouTube video, when I watched the release, I was so sad.
Thank you.
So sad.
Great. No, it's a really good point.
I mean, I saw you mention it in your research section, so we try to do what we can, and I know that there's always something we miss, and it happens to me a lot too. So, but I'm like, is it because there's the gender thing, but is it also because somehow we don't think about that person being so important to the contribution of the project? And that leads me to mental health, because I've been researching for years why sound engineers are so obnoxious most of the time. And I'm one of them, but I try not to be obnoxious, but I mean, I'm really living through hell all the time at work. And it was the case in the industry, and it's the case in academia. And one of the findings that kind of come back in many studies I'm doing is that, well, because there's no contribution, acknowledged, basically. And so there's a lot of frustration as denied, and then it gets on all the people around, the intern, the assistant, the woman, whatever. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm kind of wondering if there's anything in common with your three talks that is about the figure of the producer, and how their skills could be better valued, probably with the streaming platforms or all those things. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah.
No, that's very interesting. Thank you for that. And I think for my study looking into artist managers and artists specifically, a lot of the managers that I work with artists that are not just singers, songwriters, they're often also producers. And it's interesting how little, I guess, they discussed that aspect of their role. And as you mentioned, it's to no lack of impact. But it could, in part of my interviews when I would chat with the artist manager, sometimes it was shocking the amount that they would converse with me, and not the contacts, but just in general, how much they would chat with me. And I realized that while they're kind of following their artist around, getting interviews, radio, TV, people recognizing them in public, the artist manager is rarely, if ever, asked, "How are you? How was your day?" And I feel like that could even go further into the producer, who often is sitting on their own in a room, probably rarely asked how they are, what they're doing, and even going to the extent of it being difficult to track the credit of their work. And I could see that kind of hyperactivity that you're discussing, as you mentioned, being a lack of credit, but also just a lack of discussing. I think as, doctoral candidates, we're very rarely asked maybe, what's your thesis about? Or what are you looking into? And the moment that's kind of brought up, it's almost like an, oh my gosh, let me say everything I've wanted to say in 5 seconds. And I feel like that could be a same scenario where there's so much passion, but such a lack of questioning. And it could even then come down to people not even truly understanding what it is the producer does and how much that might impact it. And one of the biggest negatives that I've found is just the cultural perception of mental health in the music industry. And the public really has such an obscured view of what happens behind the scenes. And I'm not sure if the public will ever fully understand what that process is like. And that really affects everyone involved.
Yeah, as regards the producer's role you were talking about, I think that nowadays producers are valued like never before, because the concept of authorship is totally changed. I mean, there's no longer that clear separation between the musical work, which means those elements, creating those elements that can be translated into sheet music, and the music recording. Nowadays, the authors signed by publishing companies, songwriters. Back in the day, they were songwriters. Nowadays, they are producers, and sometimes they have no music knowledge at all, no theoretical knowledge at all, because the industry wants finished products. And so on. So I think that nowadays the way authorship has changed. It's changed in a way that the attribution of authorship resembles the industrial patents. I don't know if I made myself clear, but it's totally different from the past. I mean, George Martin didn't sign any of the Beatles songs. Nowadays, it's impossible that a producer doesn't sign a music work.
But if you're
a musical work, so I mean that I think that producers are valued as never in the past. I mean, you if you go and see the credits, you find 12 names. So you have if your goalkeeper get injured, you can substitute it. I mean, 12 authors. It's a lot. I mean, 11, 10. And there's I don't have the data just, before my eyes, but there's a study that's been done. And I mean, the average number of authors back in 1972 was 1.7 or 2.3, I can't remember. Now it's 8.6, something like that. So, I mean, today, all these figures cooperating in composing, recording, sampling, are all credited. So, I think authorship changed and it's much more recognized the figure of the producer.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, but I was more from the perspective of the listener or the user of the platform. When you can find those names as listed, you have the name, the person, and what they did, but you can't click on them. You can click on the label, you can click on the main artists who are credited through. Yeah, it's just the way the metadata. I'm not really talking about royalties. I'm talking the way it's presented to the public and the way you can search for new music, for instance. So yeah, whatever.
You were talking about the affordances of the platforms.
I mean, to be honest, the labels is similar. It's very difficult to link labels on the DSPs as well. I was going to answer your point, and so when I shared my video, Amandine, is it? Yeah, you commented on it on something that I'd said, which is it's a shame that there wasn't a female producer involved, and that was something that came up in the study that somebody said, "Oh, right, it's about women's technical roles. It's a shame that there's a man doing the production." It's a fair point, isn't it? The thing is that I think that the reason that is because of the same issue that I'm trying to represent. It's the lack of visibility. Because not only do you need to find a female producer, but it needs to be in that specific genre, working with the artist that you want to work with, that's got the sound that you want to work, with and get that sound. So again, like it's a similar thing. If every female producer, and like not to put additional burden on women in music, but if every female producer was to be making that behind the scenes, sharing that technical work in a visible way, just as, regular parts of the campaign that they're working on, I think that would improve pretty quickly. Because if everyone did it, it would just be flooded.
Yeah, I mean, there are campaigns, right? The Yorkshire Woman in Sound, or those people, they're doing... I mean, it's not necessarily your approach. I thought your approach was quite interesting. And it's linked to a study. But, there are videos and there are, like, visual ways to show that women do that. But I don't know if you saw the last numbers, the Fix the Mix report. It's 3.2% of key technical roles for women out of the whole report. So it's still extremely horrible. 3.2%, right? 2022, 2023. So that's what we're talking about. So, yeah. Yes.
And you had your hand up as well, didn't you? You had your hand up as well, yeah. Sorry, I'm just...
Coming back to the mental health, this is probably obvious, but I feel like it's important to say that maybe some of them, is there any evidence that some of the neglect in making sure that artists' mental health is in good shape is because publicity sells, and unfortunately the kind of persona of the troubled artist is something that can be marketable. And as a follow-up from that, going back to the gender issues, I wonder if there is more glamorization of the troubled artist when it comes to female performers rather than male, and that going as far back as Billie Holiday. So there is a long tradition of that becoming a selling point of an artist.
Well, I mean, historically, when women have a mental breakdown, they're crazy, and if a man does, Kanye West. Don't approve, but he once said, name one genius that ain't crazy. And that's the perspective of the male, but then the female perspective is quite different. But going back to your first point, in terms of the neglect, so I'm looking at it from the artist manager perspective, and in general, the media either ignores, glamorizes, or misinterprets an artist's mental health journey. I think more so male versus female, a bigger issue is if an artist is having drug or alcohol issues, they're often looked at, it's not looked at as a disease or an issue based on the work, it's just their personal problem. But from the artist manager standpoint, interestingly enough, it wasn't really a lack of their care. The biggest thing was if the artist was comfortable discussing their mental health. Often a musician will use writing and performing music as a creative output, but it took a very specific artist-manager relationship, and more so than that, the amount of time they had been working together for the artist to feel comfortable enough to discuss their mental health. But what's interesting about the artist-manager relationship is unless that artist has a really great support system in terms of friends and family, unless they have a therapist, the artist manager is kind of the only person that's going to have these discussions with them. And then once that's portrayed to the media and publicity, I know kind of in Hollywood, it always seems, and when I came into this study, I looked at the artist manager as almost this vindictive person trying to get the most out of the artist. But what I've discovered, if anything, is the artist manager is almost desperate to know what is going on in the artist's minds and how they could even begin to help it. That's not for every artist manager. That depended a lot how long they were in the industry and their personal experience. Yeah, it takes a lot of care from the artist manager. And then the biggest thing is the artist feeling comfortable. And then it's the artist manager's job to look at this and either keep it hidden from the media or display it in a way that benefits the artist. But in that sense, it's often more trying to be organic and true to the artist. And realistically, most of the time, they try and keep those things hush-hush. And if they do share it with the public, it's when the artist is mentally ready to share those struggles. A lot of artists, will write songs about something and it will seem as though they have conquered this issue, but behind the scenes, they're still heavily dealing with that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like I can speak on this because my doctorate was in psychology, which was in schizophrenia specifically, or schizotypy, which is like the risk, which I think is higher in musicians and artists in general. I mean, I'd hope that it's not more visible when it's a woman struggling with mental health issues, but I do think that there is probably a tendency for that to happen. And I guess the question that you're asking is, it's about exploitation, isn't it? Should that stuff be used? And it's a duty of care matter, I think, if the manager's going to be sharing things that are quite personal and may benefit the campaign in some way. It really depends. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and the same goes for producers. I mean, one of the areas that emerged from my interviews was that producers complained about the tight deadlines and the way workflows changed. And also, they complained about the fact that the new generations don't have the same competencies, the same skills that the older generation got. So I think they are pretty stressed, and in particular because there's an aspect they were insisting on. When they started their career as producers, they wanted to be artists. They went to these schools like, I don't know, the SAE Institute where I taught years ago, and they wanted to be, artists, to innovate, to express freely their creativity, but they can't under these circumstances and under this workflow methods. So I think they're kind of stressed and they admit it. So yeah, I think this. It's not really my field, but I've noticed there's something similar going on among producers as well.
This is my cue to jump in. Okay, I've been literally doing this. Firstly, I think your topics are all super interesting. So thank you for presenting your work. They're all actually very different, but this sort of commonality that links between them, which I'm very fascinated by. And I'm going to look up the empowerment scale, and I'm raging about perceived competence, and I want to solve all the problems in the world right now. But it was really thinking about the term ownership, and I'm trying to link it back to creative entrepreneurship, because I think my research comes very much from a performance an education, but I'm from the view of a performer. And it really does depend on authorship for me is, well, what is it that's being authored? And if you look at performance or music through the theoretical lens of performance studies, what is being performed may not necessarily be the musical work. It is the performer. So the concept of what is being performed, if Beyonce is performing, listen, it's not listen, it's Beyonce that's being performed. And it just got me thinking about that sort of link to the artist as brand, and about that creative entrepreneurship. I think, I don't really know what I'm trying to say other than I think there's something in there in terms of like this thread about it really does depend on what we consider the work or the product to be, particularly now. And I think particularly there are gender issues, but then that's why we need good research work into that. I'm looking at you two girls particularly, but all of your work is super interesting. But I just wondered what you thought about the concept of what was being performed is not actually the song or the recording. You know, that's not what's being performed. I'm not saying that's true. It's just my opinion. And about the artist taking the center stage as the artist as the entity that is what's being performed. And I just wonder, Brenda, if there's something in that with your topic, particularly about mental health and that kind of focus on the artist as brand. And then maybe what that means for creative entrepreneurship in 2023.
It's, saying Beyonce is interesting because Beyonce's great. No hate to Beyonce. But no. But she, for example, doesn't really, I'm not sure in the past, but currently doesn't really write her own music. So her songs are written by a room of about 100 people. So when you talk about that work and then her performance, I've always viewed different type artists in different categories. So there's creators, there's performers, there's entertainers. An entertainer would be maybe like Billy Connolly, who, sings, songwrite, comedian, probably does magic tricks on the side. We have a creator who I would consider a singer, songwriter, the type of artist who gets so anxious to perform, maybe like a bedroom pop star. And then you have a performer, and I would put Beyonce in that category. I'm sure she could sit down and do a smashing songwriting session, but at the end of the day, the way that she can sing, dance, facial expressions, cues, it is full-heartedly a performance. But in terms of mental health, I think specifically the live music sector, that is its whole own industry essentially. But in terms of the performance, touring is, there could be a dozen studies done on the mental, and there have been dozens of studies done on the mental health impacts of touring. The PTSD associated with some of them have been compared to just some very severe, sometimes like war veterans. So the actual performance itself is very interesting because, you have thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people watching you perform. You might meet 1,000 of them after or before the show for a meet and greet. You have hair and makeup. You have 10 people filming you. You do this for about 4 or 5 hours, and then at the end of the day, you go to your hotel room. And if you're lucky, it's by yourself. You get a break from the tour bus, but then you are alone. And you might think that, oh, that's ideal, get some alone time. But no one, unless you have been in that position, can you imagine what it would feel like to be hands-on, covered in people for hours and hours, and then to fully be alone. And in that performance aspect, I think that artists need to have, and managers, a separate duty of care specifically for touring. There are some great organizations that will go to festivals and provide mental health care, counseling, different types of support. But what I really haven't seen is, like, on a tour bus, you have every single member of the team, the front of house, hair and makeup, but who is there in case someone has a mental breakdown? And let me tell you, there is a guarantee there is at least 5 mental breakdowns per week, per tour. And, where is that essence and when is that going to be important enough to put on the budget to find them a space on the tour bus? And more importantly, what would that role even look like?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, such interesting points. I keep coming back to the creative entrepreneurship idea of the artist as brand, because I definitely agree with what you're saying about Beyonce in terms of, I mean, and that was just an example. I could, substitute Beyonce with I mean, yeah. But right. Right. But so I put myself in this as a consumer as well, is when I go to see Alanis Morissette, that's what I'm going to see. She could perform anything for me. Because what I have bought into is Alanis Morissette, as an example. And I don't know what it is. I'm thinking that there's just this thing about creative entrepreneurship, the artist as brand. Gosh, Brenda, that's so layered with your topic about how do you what that concept is, but then where does the producer fit into this when it's actually Alanis Morissette that I'm paying my ticket money to go and see? And then the role of gender in all of, I don't know, it's just interesting. And then what is creative entrepreneurship, I think, is what I'm getting at. When we think of the artist as a brand and that what we are going to see is not the musical work, but the performer, that has so much repercussion, I potentially think, for all of your topics. Where is the role for everybody in this? When actually we're in an industry that is about business and about generating income and sustainability and, is Alanis Morissette any different to McDonald's? And yes.
Can I try and answer something? I mean, I don't know if I'm answering what you're asking, actually, but...
I actually don't know what I'm really asking, but I think I'm sort of saying about maybe the commonality is that the artist as a brand is the center of everything that we're thinking about in terms of creative entrepreneurship. But there's so much ramification on all of your topics for that.
I mean, I'm thinking, when you're talking about the performer versus the writer versus the team, and if you think about royalties, there are entities that deal with the royalties of the songwriters. There's royalties that deal with the entities that are involved in the recording process. However, when you get on the stage, the only remuneration, that the performers get is from the fee. So I guess it's about fairer paying conditions for artists. I've got a student that's taking on her undergraduate project on creating a mental health rider for touring. And touring is very challenging, like you were saying, I'm also a touring artist, and I'm not playing to hundreds of thousands of people, but sometimes thousands. And I remember the first tours that we did, we would go to all these different places and then actually meet loads of new people. And the first tour I ever did, I was just like crying when I left, because I was like, I've just made all these new friends and now I have to go. It was actually really weird. And then you just become more desensitized to it. And then, there should be more focus on mental health. What are artists meant to do for the 6 hours that they're there between sound check and performance? Get a PlayStation there, or, stuff like that. So, yeah, maybe this royalties part is what you're thinking, because it's quite possible that, the writer that you like, perhaps Alanis Morissette, I think she did write her own stuff, but if she didn't, and if she was not heavily credited on the recording, it might be that there's no royalty that covers her as a brand, as a performer.
Yes, and then the brand, the performer as an entity, and what does that involve? I think. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Hussein had a question.
I have a few, as a matter of fact. So, what about the artist whose career is fading, heading it off into the sunset, and perhaps the record label or whatever don't really return their calls as quickly? Because that's another extension of this thing, that the idea that shelf lives are really short, right? And unless you are able to go beyond those initial, let's say 18 months and be generous, if you can't go beyond that, you might not actually, by any test of being in business, if you get to 5 years, you've probably got a business. If you get to 10 years, you are in business, right? So this question of how these careers become established is an interesting one. I do have three, so you can you can interject now.
Oh, really? Well, I was just going to say that if you're a female performer, you might have never had the record deal. So just putting it out there.
I mean, I've done a few too many of those sorts of things. Massimiliano, in terms of platforms, have you read Francois Pachet, who is the senior technology officer for Spotify? So one of their AIs that they're developing, he's very confident that it will help artists and producers manipulate users better. So the way that I interpret what he's talking about is that it's looking at a kind of a feedback loop system. So if you release a track, you get a listener response. That listener response goes back to the producer and goes, maybe shave 3 seconds off here, maybe do this bit here, maybe the dynamics are a bit too quiet, maybe they need to lift a bit more. And then you make another version of the track and you send that out so that it's this continuous kind of feedback loop of kind of domination. Have you sort of had a look at any of...
They're working on it in this... in Paris, they have this artificial intelligence project. I think that he...
Flow Machines? No, he left Flow Machines,
okay.
So he's in Spotify now.
Yeah,
so this
but I think they are
right.
headquartered in Paris,
yes.
Aren't they?
Yeah.
And Spotify has got this this unit working on these technologies. Yeah, let's see what happens. I mean, they established this project 3 years ago, I guess. 2 years ago, I can't remember when.
It's been ongoing. I mean, certainly since they got Echo Nest.
Let's see what happens. Yes, the Echo Nest was mentioned many times by my interviewees, and they said that even though they don't know what are the features of acousticness, of speechiness, and danceability, they're trying to study how to reach that levels. They're kind of imagining how to do it, how to make it. And for instance, I don't know, listen to, Dua Lipa bass lines and saying, okay, I gotta equalize it that way. The bass must be equalized that way because it probably enhances danceability. So they mentioned that, and they say that once, they have their. Sometimes they're pretty arrogant because they say, I know how it works. I know how it works, and it's fairly easy to replicate because once you got how to do it, you don't have to repeat the process from scratch because it's fairly easy to replicate. It's always like that. So you equalize the bass that way, and it's gonna work. It's gonna circulate more on the platform. So they are trying to study independently from these experiments they are doing in Paris. I'm always very skeptical when it comes with artificial intelligence and the way they can manipulate listeners. I think that listeners always have their autonomy and they can negotiate their taste in an autonomous way. So I don't think that one day we will be completely manipulated by these.
No, I actually don't think so. But that's obviously their rationale in terms of how they create the creator tools to essentially monetize beyond merely just uploading from the DSPs into the various platforms. How you monetize once you are an artist who's on the platform. What do? So there are things like the plagiarism detectors. There's the stuff, there's stuff to do with the. Forego a little bit of your royalty percentage to pay for placement to get in front of all of these various kind of let me try and grab as much money back as kind of possible. Now, staying with you, so Rick Rubin recently has said he has neither technical skill nor musical competency, and yet he is a successful producer. So your kind of claim of the less than, somehow they're not as technically gifted or competent or abilities, sort of flies almost diametrically opposed to, say, someone who is pretty successful, Rick Rubin. Whether I like him or not is irrelevant, but he is successful. And so the thing is the question then, in your study, how you account for that. Because it's always to me, it's always the anomalies. I'm not worried about generally the direction of travel. I'm always interested in the ones that buck the trend, because the ones that buck the trend are kind of an indicator of what the future might be like. right?
Yeah, can I read an excerpt that I think is very meaningful to reply to your answer? There's a producer who says,
Please.
"We're up against a generation of people who just wing it and learn how to produce by watching YouTube videos and downloading cracked software. But you know what? They're the ones selling the records. While I'm in the studio sweating and trying to figure out which analog flanger to use while mixing a Charleston track, they've already gone platinum."
Yes. Jake is a really good example of that, you know. But the thing is Jake's track has complexity. It has technical ability, it has complexity. You got passing chords, you got all sorts of things. And it's like, my 7-year-old daughter, Lizzie, loves the track, right? Now, she's not encountered it from any particular, it's not come from any gatekeeper, it's just turned up on something, right? And they can sing it to me. Her and her brothers, they can all sing it to me and they all love it. And I'm like, how did you know about this? Well, it's come up on some YouTube video somewhere and it attracts them.
And that's why a younger, more optimistic interviewee said, the fact that we no longer...
Marvelous, I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, but it's very interesting because the fact that we no longer spend time in giant recording studios with analog machines doesn't mean professional standards have dropped. With samples, VSTs, or working with assisted composition applications from home or project studios, the quality of the end result is simply better for what the markets demand today.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, you've got all of those in there. I just wonder sometimes, because I also noticed it in the video as well, that you made, that just to sort of, I suppose, foreground that message against it, because it feels like the slightly more, it's all turning to, you know, is kind of the one that kind of gets through rather than the more optimistic sort of, this is actually, because it's essentially this is what leads to the next one. This will be the last one. I'll give the microphone up, I promise. When you look at, say, someone like, so I did a paper on like Missy Elliott, where she basically, Billboard do the tweet that says, "Where are all the female producers?" And Missy Elliott goes, "I'm here." It's just you don't recognize them as such. And then when you look at, say, Paula Wolf's Art of Record Production one, which is 2012, I think it is 2012. It's 2012, isn't it? Where she interviews the CEO for Chrysalis, Jeremy Lascelles, who then says, "Well, it's because most of the women self-produce, therefore they aren't really producers in the traditional sense, in the George Martin, Giles Martin, and, you know, Bob Ludwig or whatever. They're just not in that kind of mode. Therefore, they are not really producers." And, you know, this then, in terms of the recognition thing, becomes the real issue that actually, despite actually doing it, it still becomes devalued because you don't quite meet the benchmark of being a producer. And what's really interesting is when you then look at, say, someone like Richard Burgess and his typologies of producers, it's really difficult to fit these kind of women producers in, or producers of other kind of colour and whatever else. They don't really fit in that kind of model. And then more recently, like Phil Harding and Nissim Lefford, you know, they said that actually the producer roles are much more just leadership roles. And so now I find myself in a position going, so you're trying to say that women aren't really leaders either now because they self-produce. You see, they don't lead people. So every time they keep sort of shaving and slicing and dicing, it always feels like, but then there's this demographic that will be left out because they don't do leadership because they're just doing it themselves. So that empowerment, the principle of empowerment becomes a real problem because by doing it yourself and showing you can do it yourself, you also exclude yourself from being considered under those traditional roles based on those rubrics that a lot of those academics do. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's quite a lot going on there, but no, it's great though.
Welcome to my world.
It's really interesting, and you've got so many interesting points there. You know, it's funny because actually the video that I shared about the technical stuff, I do have production credits on that record that was being filmed. So the thing is that obviously I wasn't the lead producer on it, but yeah, because you can't see it, because it's not a visible role, because you're a performer, then people would assume that it's not there, but it should be. And why, you know, perhaps maybe because maybe some people, I mean myself, you know, I'm not particularly pushing that, oh, I need these credits on here, but I did definitely do additional production. I had a lot of input on how the sound would be, which things, oh, maybe that needs to go up, or oh, that bit needs tightening up, or, that aspect of the production. So yeah, I get it that maybe some of that is a lack of visibility about the input in the production role. But going back to the point of recognition and credit, on the record that we'd done the videos for, actually the producer was the highest paid member of the team. So in a way, maybe that lack of recognition is because of the more money. Maybe everyone else is like, hey, these people are getting so much more than us, and we're the performers. Maybe there's a little bit of that going on. Maybe. Producers, feel free to jump in with that. They're very well, yeah.
Self-producers as well, right?
Well, but that's the thing. I think that the self-production comes out of the necessity as well, because time, it's not infinite budget and time that can be spent. So some of that additional production was because we didn't have budget for the producer. Therefore, I take it in a studio with a friend and we do all the edits and then take it back for the overall polish of sound. But that is a budgetary issue. But the thing is that while production costs have gone up dramatically, performer fees haven't. So it's quite difficult to balance.
Yeah, if I may, I'm very glad that we're getting into that. So a few things. First of all, I agree with you with the categorization of producers being problematic when you try to put women producers, but not only women producers. I work in West Africa and their way of doing production doesn't fit in that. Now, those studies were all done with white, UK, USA-based male producers in major cities. And there are some studies that are about interviews of 19 London white male producers, and they're making generalization of this, extremely problematic. Now, the problem, and I'm very familiar with Paula Wolf's work, and she explained very well why these women tend to self-produce, stay alone, don't go to audio schools, don't go to the recording studio, the commercial recording studio, and then became this very good artist producer and don't get credited as such so much because, they, whatever. So and I think it's what you're explaining about your role, and then you have an engineer coming in and gets more paid than everybody else. Yeah, and that's exactly the place that women can't get, but not just women, again, people who are marginalized in all sorts of ways. And that is super important to think about this, because what is denied in this whole thing is the technical aspects. And when we say, okay, like there's going to be some AI telling you what to compress, what to EQ, I'm like, sure, but you still need to do it, And so the last, I would say 6 years since I decided to quit the industry and go full-time in academia, I'm mostly using my technical skills to teach. And I work with Women in the Studio National Accelerator in Canada, and I work with the Western African Network that I created myself in West Africa. And what I mostly teach is how to use a compressor and a limiter, because that's how you get, you get some loudness, and it's how your track is going to cut through. And this is so underlooked. I mean, it's, I have to convince people, not the engineers and producers, especially the women producers, they just want this as the man empowerment tool that people need to learn. But, it's something that is not sexy for some reason, And also, like, when you know how to do it very well, it's like, you're not going to put that on your CV, right? You're not going to, no. So it is where the problem lies. It's like, why are we denying all this aspect of thing? We're not denying that somebody can play the guitar certain ways. It doesn't mean that they're a great guitar player, but it's like, oh, they train, they spend hours in their life learning how to play the guitar. It has values, I guess. But somebody who trained for 7 years, I'm a Tonmeister, so it's 7 years of listening tests and produces, training, whatever. Does it count? No. And that's the problem. I think we need to understand, as well as cinema did in the 1960s with the new wave, and looking at cinema as like a way to produce film and make films with editing, with like real knowledge. We need to think about records this way. And that will really bring a different view on what people do, and especially for women, because that's where the problem lies. Thank you.
Can I just come back on that? So I do also, I work at BIMM. I'm the course leader of music business, but I also run a label in a studio, and we're in the process of getting the studio up. Maybe I'm going to try and do something with that in mind because, I'd never thought about it that way. So thanks.
Yeah, so it's funny, just before I get to my main, something about Rick Rubin saying I'm not technically competent. That's branding, because I've seen him work and he's very technically competent, but doesn't want to be perceived as technically competent, which I think is another interesting angle on what we were just saying there, which is... It's a really interesting, yeah. And I've seen this before with some top engineers, and they go, "Oh no, I'm not a technical person," and they say, "But actually, can I go for I don't want to go for the 1073. Can we go for the 1081 because I prefer the Class AB amplifier?" And I'm like, "Okay, you're technically competent." There's no two ways about it. And just very quickly for Massimiliano, I think it's interesting. There's some interesting developments that actually sort of false started about 10, 12 years ago around things like bronze format, where you could have music that was distributed in a way that was different each time you heard it. And as a user, you could then lock into a version you liked and it would then improve it. There is continuing development in AI around putting the ownership back with the artist, about reconnecting with their public, not through the label, through giving the artist more ability to interact, which kind of pulls me back into the live sound element that you were talking about. And as somebody who I'd probably describe myself as a survivor of multiple world tours with proper A-list artists around the world over the years, and you do survive tours, you do. And actually the tour picture you're painting is one that's I think at the best end of it, compared with some others. And I had a little story I wanted to share from, I'm not going to mention names because it wouldn't be appropriate around, it's a very, very recent story about an artist who during COVID, she had suffered various mental health issues and decided through the vessel of TikTok to share those issues with fans. She was sort of established as a top liner, actually. She was a top liner who actually then sort of used TikTok to actually help herself recover from mental health and addiction problems, to the point where there was then an audience of people clamoring for more content and this feeling they had to make this content. And then she's now touring her music that's all about this whole process. And she's just done a gig, and and it's interesting. When you tour, you suddenly make the decision, right? How am I going to get recognised? And eventually, you've got to go to Live Nation. It's like, right, it's got to be Live Nation. Recently, did a gig in a major city, large venue. The guarantee was £100. So the guaranteed pay was £100. Now the deal obviously goes beyond that. There's the 70% of the ticket sales, the first 70%, 100% to the venue, and then the next 30%, 70% of it goes to the artist. But even so, with the tour costs, without looking at merch, they're looking at a £25,000 loss for the tour. And people regularly say, oh, live sound, that's where you make your money. Now, they're doing better than they expected on merch. So they're looking at about 10 quid a head from merch. So they may come 10 grand down. But the interesting thing is, because they've sold out all of these venues, now they're going, oh, let's do another tour. And we can now give you all of this. And actually she's run this whole tour herself and is actually, I think, struggling again with mental health off the back of this, because she's got a very, very small team, because they had to make a small team to make it work. Huge pressures on the TO, who actually is also dealing with everyone's mental health. And it's interesting, I think the TO is the tour organizer, the person who does end up often doing that job, along with often a musical director, because they may be working more locally with the performers, but everything's done to bare bones. And it's interesting that she's had to take the tour to prove the brand as viable. And now she's going, well, actually, do I go with them, or do I just go direct to the venue? Because I don't have label representation. Dodie's another good example of this, right? I remember the first time her record, because it was involved in the record, hit the top 10 in the charts. And they announced the charts, and it went 7, and then they went straight to 5. They didn't even say number 6, because it was an artist without a label who had built her profile through social media. Entirely her profile through social media, and believe me, I know the pressures that person is under to keep a profile that her public wants to connect with, which doesn't necessarily represent the person that is in that moment, but the person and there's all that mental health burden, and still the keys are still held by the labels, and by people like Live Nation, because that. And well, yeah. Because again, they have shareholders. Everyone has a boss. Everyone has a shareholder. Everyone has to report to somebody. There is that process. But that, to me, we're talking about these elements about how do we support this? How do we support this? But it strikes me that we're sort of chipping away at the bottom, the sort of bottom that's feeding the top, and the top recognizes the problems, but actually doesn't have a great deal of incentive to change it, because actually everyone else is trying to change process to keep the institutions running, if you like, which I think is a major issue. And the funny thing is, actually, when you look at this tour, actually you might think, oh well, the promoter actually there's no pressure on them. They don't care if the room's empty, to be perfectly honest, because the room's there anyway. So there's not even any real burden to promote. The only times there becomes burden to promote is when the artist becomes established as a brand to the point where they can then name their terms. And that's the interesting transition at the moment for this artist, is I think she's realising now that she's in a position to name her terms and actually doesn't know, and this is something we're seeing more and more, actually do they want to name their terms to that institution that has forced them into a position of taking a £10,000 to £25,000 loss on a tour just to prove that you're worthy of this acknowledgement by this thing that exists above. And again, in the studio, you're talking in the studio there about this expectation of a finished product being delivered. People invest in finished products now. They don't necessarily invest because that once something is successful, because you're going to have to invest more in it, you're better off with something new. So and that has led to the very trend-based social media driven, all these things. And I'm not saying that's just the way it is. And I think the comment you're making about the studio, there's people don't know how to use a studio anymore. Does that even matter? Like the amount of time it takes to make a thing is not a guarantee of creative success. But it can be a factor. Time is a quality all of its own, isn't it? But it doesn't just because you spent that time doesn't mean you spent it well. So I think it's very difficult to sort of necessarily have a sort of quality on that when the people who are driving, for them, speed of turnover has become crazy important. But I think the live industry actually captures it incredibly well, and I think that story is quite an interesting story about somebody who's actually in the process of going through everything you've spoken about today, in terms of, and by going through that fight, questioning whether actually the thing they thought they wanted is what they wanted at all. So yeah, I suppose there's not really a question there as such, but I just thought it was it was just an interesting kind of a sort of, almost like a case study that's happened. I mean, they're playing tonight. I can't remember where they are tonight, but they're one of my graduates is the tour manager for it. So that's how I'm hearing about a lot of these things with the TMing that they do, and it's for me it was a kind of empowering and incredibly sad story all at the same time, because it highlighted all the problems and I was quite shocked because I was thinking, well, it must be nice that they're on tour being successful. And then I heard the terms. And I don't necessarily think that had that been a male artist, the guarantee would have been £100.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. I completely agree. And from the management perspective, I hate to say it, but that at the end of the day is fault to whoever negotiated that deal. Whoever is representing that. Yeah. And sometimes, don't play. I know, some of these tours or these gigs can seem like a dream come true, but walking on stage, not pretending, but saying you're a rock star and knowing in the back of your head what you're bringing in at the end of the day. But that's a very interesting story because it really could be an entire case study on the double-edged sword that is social media. So from my study, more than half of participants stated that social media was the reason that these conversations and awareness around mental health has increased. And while that is true, social media is also a huge contender in the negative mental health aspects. And the artist that you've discussed is a great example of the oversharing side of social media. So while an artist like that does a lot for the public can think, I'm not alone. There's this pop star having the same issues I am. There's a song I can relate to. The other end of that is that this artist could have possibly made their brand around their impact of mental health. So not only could that be an everlasting brand that they cannot let go of. So let's say they deal with their mental health struggles. They're still pinned as that person. Kid Cudi is an example of an artist who wrote a lot of music about negative mental health issues. He left the industry for about 5 years and came back with more uplifting and positive music. It didn't hit as well. I personally love it, but that's not what the fan base was there for. And on the other end of this, in terms of the artist perspective, hearing that story, it makes me extremely emotional because I know for a fact that that artist experiences not only in person, but in their Instagram DMs, their TikTok messages, what I am sure is people emotionally outpouring onto them. And this whole cultural perception and that idea that we can so easily access these artists is truly, in my mind, a little bit messed up. And I work with an artist, and seeing her do these meet and greets and seeing young women and young men and young women outpouring, these artists. And I've had an artist that has saved my life. And, to get the opportunity to say that is beautiful. But at the end of the day, this artist needs to compartmentalize the impact they have. And let's say the artist you're discussing, manages to work through a lot of mental health issues, writes a positive album. Then they have the effect of all the fans saying, well, I thought you were one of us. We no longer relate to you. Your music isn't relatable. It's because you're rich now. And there's truly no escape, and there's no right answer from that. So that's kind of where I come to the result of don't play. And sometimes as a manager or as an artist, that may seem like the worst case. But if, unless you've asked 1,000 people and that is the only response you're getting, I really believe that there has to be better options out there. Because at the end of the day, if you're an artist in that position, they are without a doubt giving free therapy in their DMs. And for them to simply be paid to go to a gig is like the baseline that they kind of deserve in this scenario.
Can I ask, was that headline tour? Was that support? It must be support, right?
Yeah, it was a single artist headline tour so it would be Academy 2, Academy 3 size venues, sort of the probably, I think they did a couple of 350s that they said they would never do again, but generally 600 to 1,500 capacity venues, which is a pretty common size for sort of artists that have social media following. I'd say that there's a real sort of growth in that size venue for that type of event, which is, again, an entirely social media driven crowd. And just again to comment on that, I know from another artist I've worked with, where she would take a day off social media and people would send notes, DMs about them, wanting to end life, etc. And so actually the for being off and the reason they were off is because they were on stage, and it's like the pressure that is on artists to share and to be shared with. And I think actually that's a really important point. It's not just them constantly sharing, but it's also being a recipient and then commenting in such a way that people feel this connection that goes beyond. Well, I've seen what it's done to a couple of artists, and it's horrendous.
Yeah, just answering your point about the fees, the agent needs to represent them a little bit better, because usually you would have a fee or a split. So if the shows do well, you can give people initial, like a low reduction if it's not doing well.
It was just a particularly low guarantee in this occasion, but there is still. I mean, the deal was pretty standard in terms of the return on the effective profit. But
right.
Yeah, but it's still
the baseline.
It's a shock to me. It's offensive. Actually, it's it's an offensive number to put there. You're better off saying nothing. Like it was, and that's just because that, you know, and I don't really want to particularly call out the promoter in this case, but actually they know that they can do it. They do it because they can, and there's no pressure to change it.
I think, you know, that's kind of an argument for fair pay for musicians as well, because if you calculate the hours that musicians are spending at shows from the start till the end, then you would just say, well, at least the baseline would be a fair hourly wage and so on.
Brilliant. All right, leading on to that, I'd like to just have a quick, just get all of your thoughts on, we're having these industrial models to me that feel like they're written by investment bankers of squeeze, I'm going to get all socialist now, squeeze the workers as much as possible, and the artists tend to be the workers, make as much profit for my shareholders as possible. The music industry has always been that to some extent, but I think we've hit a point where it's that on steroids now. And I think it's a wider societal issue that's really obvious in music. And if I get your comments on that, and then the other comment would be, the way we get through it is we disrupt it, right? We always think, let's disrupt, and we can disrupt through technology. But I can't think of an example where technology has particularly improved the lives of workers more than momentarily. So there's a little momentary tech disruption, and then all of a sudden Spotify are getting incredibly rich, Apple Music are getting incredibly rich, and artists are told, oh, you can distribute your work to the world now. But the reality is yeah, sure you can, but the people who sell the phones are the ones who are going to make the money. And I think we've almost sleptwalked into a system of hyper-capitalism that might be the problem, and the only ones disrupting it are the more hyper-capitalist tech disruptors, and I think the next one will be AI, and the incentives for all of this is more profit, more profit, more profit, more profit. Like Andrew's story before, more profit. Women get paid less because we can make them be paid less so we can make more profit, and wonder if there's a larger systemic issue there that we can just fix.
Can I go with answering?
Can I just say, could we do that quickly, because we've got 5 minutes left of the session, so I don't want to push, but maybe we can continue during refreshments as well.
Thank
but
God
if we
I
can
asked
have
such a small question.
I know, but if we can have a
it's
quick
not a small
answer,
question.
then great.
So yeah, I think the thing is that if we look at the music industry as a whole, we've got to remember that, you know, the Sonys of this world, Apples, you know, basically when we've got a big label, there's other products that they're selling as well. So in a way, music can be a loss leader. And, you know, the big labels don't particularly care how many artist brands there are. So smaller artist teams, independent labels fighting to bring their artists up to a growth size where the finances are all right and everyone's making money and doing great. This is kind of not the reality of getting it out there. And yeah, sure, everyone can put music on streaming sites, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be heard by anyone or get past any gatekeepers. So yeah, it is a big issue. I don't really have a solution for it. But yeah, just keep going. So don't give up.
I always tend to think of it is that we look at all the decisions we make. If we took money out of those decisions, they would seem utterly insane. And I think sometimes the music industry is a bit like that. Like if you pulled the money out of it, I mean, easy fix, of course. Let's all live in a Star Trek utopia. But yeah, I just thought I'd throw that little grenade in right at the end.
Yeah, and in terms of that, I feel like I talk about in my study the human resource theory of management, and very quickly, it was in 1932. It's basically when El Tomeo brought kind of human resources into the workplace. They did a study where they wanted to increase productivity, so they changed the lighting and the seating for the factory workers. And while productivity improved, it was not the lighting or seating changes. It was when the workers thought that their managers cared about them. And this is, HR does not exist in the music industry. A&R is kind of what everyone considers HR. So as Dan was saying, the fans, the consumers are guiding the industry. And until fans and consumers and people inside the industry look at industry workers as humans that need to be cared for and look at artists as people rather than brands, there will be no change, and we will continue to be stepped on and pushed to the side with technology, and we will be expected to adapt until the cultural perception begins to change. And we're either in the beginning of it now, or we'll kind of watch it be swept aside. But conversations like this are just the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be very brief. I absolutely agree with your socialist point of view, and I'd say that many producers I've met during my research study use the metaphor of the McDonald's sandwich. Same recipe. The songs have to have the same look, same recipe to be consumed quickly. And I think that nowadays music must be produced in a way that makes the music respond to some principles of calculability and predictability. And I think everything's going that direction because of the artist as brand kind of thing. I think that music is just one of the commodities traded by the music industry. And the music industry is not longer controlled by music entrepreneurs, but it relies on IT companies whose interest is not music, actually. So I think it's just, you're selling a brand, and included with all the things, you find the music. But it's just one of the things. It's just one of the products, one of the commodities. So,
but take away the music, what does the commodity have?
You're right, but it's not their primary source of gain. I mean, they don't get the best money from the music, but for instance, from the traffic generated, because the traffic and the platform traffic attracts the investors, and that brings you the profit. So I mean, it's a complex matter, but I think music is kind of a marginal thing. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, like we said, refreshments downstairs, I'm assuming. Yes. So thank you to our speakers. Thank you for all your contributions as well. It's been great.